that don't know, my name is Ariam Torres, and I think about 2 weeks ago, I finished my PhD in urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So I'm still in that post defense, post graduation feeling. I don't know if I'm happy or uh, I don't know how I feel yet. But yeah, at least I finished. So that happened.
You should
Um,
feel very, very happy, but yes, I
yeah,
get you.
I'm
That's
waiting for
super.
it to kick in, but it hasn't. Uh, I also want to say thank you to Lucila Marvel for joining, to Marta and to Alfredo. Thank you for being here and for your interest. So my dissertation was titled The Struggle for a Just Recovery, Insurgent Planning, Transnational Networks, and Colonial Legacies in Post-Disaster Puerto Rico. And I expect and I hope actually that it will be available early in the fall semester, so perhaps August or September. And then just before I go on, I just want to mention and give a shout out to my amazing committee, was led by Dr. Rolf Pendel. He's the department head, but also he was my advisor and chair of my committee. His focus, his research focus is on housing and racial justice in housing. Also, Professor Farnak Miraftab. She is also in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning, and her focus is on feminist planning and insurgent planning mainly. Dr. Robert Olshansky, I don't know if you've had him here already, but he's an expert in post-disaster recovery, and he has great experience doing research and working in different jurisdictions, not just in the US, but also in India, in China, and other places in Asia. And he has taken an interest in Puerto Rico for the last few years, and it's been working, right? And even I think it has a couple of publications with Evis and other folks about Puerto Rico. So they're all very interested in what's been going on here in the island. And finally, Dr. Deepak Lambanieves, who's Puerto Rican. He lives in Puerto Rico and he currently works at the Center for the New Economy. But he is also a adjunct professor at the Graduate School of Planning at UPR. And his main research focus was on transnational networks and social remittances. But here in Puerto Rico, he does a lot of work on reconstruction and recovery policy, etc. And I also want to give a special thanks to Ivis Garcia, who has been an inspiration, a role model, a mentor, and a friend really since I began to look at PhD programs, I think back in 2016. So thank you, Ivis. I appreciate all your help throughout all these years, and I'm looking forward to find ways to collaborate now that I finally graduated. So having said all that, right, this is when my dissertation project started. So I'm sure you have all heard by now and experienced in September of 2017, Hurricane Maria struck Puerto Rico. It was a Category 5 hurricane, caused devastating damage to thousands of homes, to the island's electric power infrastructure, transportation network, communication systems, right? Basically everything. More than 3,000 people died. Tens of thousands of people were forced to migrate. Hundreds of thousands were left without electricity for months. You know, with homes, bridges, roads destroyed, basically complete chaos, right? So when Maria struck, I had basically just started my PhD. I started in August 2017. Maria arrived in September, just a month later. And I come from an environmental justice background, so I began reflecting and trying to write about how the storm basically ripped the veil of Puerto Rico's colonial reality and exposed a lot of things that were already ongoing, right? Including, I mentioned some here, right? The multiple layers of injustice that Puerto Ricans have been subjected to, including the Jones Act, cabotage laws, most recently Promesa. Also, a government who was starved from capacity, right? We had a government with a huge public debt, and it was undergoing a process of structural adjustment policies, among other things. Also policy failures, right? Mainly those related to implementing the US disaster policy framework, which was not designed considering Puerto Rico, right? It was designed considering other jurisdictions in the US with other realities. But after Maria, where it was imposed in Puerto Rico, right? And that didn't actually fit well, and it generated complexities. And also just general widespread poverty and vulnerability that many had been ignoring for decades, right? But it just came to light, right? Surfaced after Maria, all these issues. But in addition to the crisis and to the failures of the state, Maria also uncovered, and I think this is perhaps even more interesting, Maria uncovered previously less detected or emerging spaces of grassroots action. And these spaces are actually placed, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes, but as a general introduction, these spaces of action are placed in a spectrum that ranges from unsanctioned practices to sanctioned practices, right? Sanctioned or unsanctioned by the government in general. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And also, and as Maria, shed light on these spaces of action and on this spectrum, it also shed light on how bottom-up planning efforts were used to advance social transformation. So this basically, it allowed us to see a movement, a grassroots movement in Puerto Rico that was perhaps previously less detected, but was present, or it was emerging because of the hurricane and of the crisis. And a bunch of different planning dynamics that I think inform or have the potential to inform planning theory and planning practice, specifically for disaster recovery, but also for planning in general. And also, it shed light on some transnational spaces and networks of action. People have been talking about how the diaspora has increased in numbers in the last decade. I think today we have more than double of the Puerto Ricans living in the US stateside and over those that are living in Puerto Rico, right? So the Puerto Rican nation, the Puerto Rican community is transnational in that way. And after Maria, some transnational networks and dynamics directed towards recovery took place. Some of them were traditionally helping support movements in Puerto Rico, but others like the one I'll show you later on, it involved more complex practices and more complex transnational planning. So, just a bunch of interesting stuff. And this is actually what I focus mostly on. So I just mentioned that, post Maria, this new spaces of action emerged from the shadows. So what does disaster literature has to tell us about this, right? So the first thing that disaster planning literature tells us, and this is part of the work of Robert Olshansky, which is the person I presented in my committee. He has done a lot of work on developing the concept of time compression, which he defines as the intensification of urban development activities in time and space. And basically, once an event strikes, an event like a hurricane, things start to move in fast forward, right? Things start to move really fast. Also, literature tells us that civic groups emerge to fill recovery gaps when the government capacity is limited. And this could be information gaps, communication gaps, reaching underserved or marginalized communities, and many other things, right? And we know also that social capital and networks provide these civic sector groups with avenues to develop the recovery agenda. So the more social capital and networks, the better the civic groups are positioned to advance their recovery agendas. There are also some other things we know about context similar to Puerto Rico, right? We know that Puerto Rico is in a unique social and political space, being part of one of the world's most powerful nation, but at the same time, being in a space located in the global south with many similarities to global south countries. So what do we know about global south and colonial contexts similar to Puerto Rico? Well, in addition to what we know from post-disaster environments, we also know some things about colonial context. And one of the main things, or one thing of special interest here, is the notion of invited and invented spaces of action. And this is a concept that I play a lot with in my dissertation, and which has been mainly developed by Farnak Miraftab in her work on Insurgent in planning. So invited spaces are, and this is an adaptation, an adapted definition from literature, are legible forms of citizen participation that government authorities find acceptable under their sanctioned political framework. Is what I talked earlier about the sanction, right, and unsanctioned. And then invented spaces emerge as local communities struggle to gain material access in contexts where invited spaces for participation fail to deliver necessities or to distribute resources equitably. And again, this is just an introduction of what we know, sort of the lib review. I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about this in a few minutes. So when we combine basically what we know about time compression and the gaps notion, right, that the notion that civic groups fill recovery gaps when government capacity is limited, when we combine that with the invited and invented spaces of action, then we look at community recovery and see the nuts and bolts of how communities recover in Puerto Rico from the bottom up. Right, so this is all about a post-disaster analytic perspective. And this is something that I think is very important, right? We talk in planning, there's a lot of talk about top down and bottom up. But what does this analytic positionality have to say in a context of disaster recovery, and specifically in a context of post-disaster recovery in Puerto Rico? So looking from the top down, we see government struggles and government failures, right? I think everyone here has read news reports, publications, reports, etc., about how the government has failed, the struggles in a colonial context, etc. So there's no secret, right, how the government at the state level, federal and state government levels have struggled and failed in many policy and implementation areas for disaster recovery. But we also see a wide range of civic actors and organizations trying to fill the gaps left by official institutional recovery process, right? I'm also sure you have discussed and seen and heard about multiple groups and non-profit organizations that emerged to fill the gaps and have done amazing work in Puerto Rico. However, looking from the bottom up, we see a wide range of grassroots groups developing recovery initiatives in areas where there is no government presence or where the government obstructs recovery opportunities for underserved and marginalized populations. And this is an important, for me, this is an important part. It has been very important, a very important distinction for disaster recovery, but for planning in general. When we look at disaster recovery from the bottom up, instead of just seeing civic groups filling the gaps, we see groups operating in ways that can be in collaboration with, in opposition to, or completely beyond the purview of formal planning. And I think these nuances matter greatly because they not only show what grassroots movements do or are willing to do, they also show how the government is failing its citizens, either due to the lack of capacity or due to the fact that the government is acting in ways that actually perpetuate existing inequalities and injustices, right? So this is a big deal. And from this positionality, I was able to identify some gaps or opportunities, I should say, for research in disaster recovery planning. First, the planning practices and meanings that grassroots groups use for disaster recovery, especially in contexts of low government capacity like Puerto Rico. How grassroots groups maneuver through invited and invented spaces of action in pursuit of a just recovery. Also, the transnational dimensions of disaster recovery, and literature on the invited spaces of citizen participation in post-disaster recovery planning. And it's a big deal because in Puerto Rico in the last few years, there have been a lot of planning processes, right? Basically, Maria sort of set forward a bunch of different planning processes at state level and municipal levels, right? For example, at the municipal levels in Puerto Rico, in the last few years, we've worked with hazard mitigation planning programs. And more recently, we're currently working with municipal recovery planning programs. Also at the community level, we have the whole community resilience planning program, which haven't really started yet, sort of like it's still in the pre-planning phase, but it's scheduled to start sometime soon, later this year. And other processes, right? So there's some spaces for invited that the government has used to invite communities and local stakeholders to participate. So what do those spaces look like, right? And to what extent do they help advance a better, more effective, more just recovery? Okay, so this something very important also. Looking from the bottom up, I decided to use the insurgent planning theory as a planning framework, right? As a lens to see through for three main reasons, and these are listed here in the slide. First, an insurgent planning framework allows one to see the capacity of planning, not just in the professional planners, but extended to community organizers, activists, and everyday citizens, right? So planning is not an exclusive practice of professionals. It's also a practice that can be mobilized by activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens. Second, insurgent planning framework allows one to see the planning practices and meanings mobilized by grassroots movements to advance their agendas, right? So what are the practices and what are the meanings and values of those practices, right? What are they trying to advance? And then third, insurgent planning as a lens allows one to see the spaces of direct action, which, like I mentioned earlier, could be in collaboration with, in opposition to, or completely beyond the purview of formal planning. And I'll show some examples of this later. So the focus and scope, basically my dissertation built on the theoretical notion, analytic value of invited and invented spaces of action to examine community recovery from a bottom-up perspective, right? I've mentioned this already. And this approach allowed me to see, to understand and see and be able to reflect, at least preliminarily, three key stories about community recovery. The first one from the standpoint of the grassroots recovery movement in Puerto Rico. The second one from the standpoint of the transnational spaces and networks of action, right? What were the dynamics going on between the diaspora and community groups in the island and those that migrated or were displaced, actually. And the third, also taking a look at the conventional invited spaces for citizen participation, which are mainly in those planning programs and processes that I mentioned earlier: municipal recovery planning, whole community resilience planning, hazard mitigation planning at federal, state, and municipal levels, and others similar to these. And then in terms of methodology, right, I decided to organize my dissertation instead of a book. It's formatted as a research project of 3 different publishable papers, and each paper is formatted as a standalone piece, right? So each one of them are individual pieces, but they are conceptually linked through the notion of invited and invented spaces of action. And obviously they all have to do with disaster recovery from a bottom-up perspective, community recovery in Puerto Rico. So I developed 3 papers. First one is Bomba planning, and these are, I still haven't sent them for publications. I'm working in some final revisions. So these titles are still preliminary, but the first one is about Bomba planning, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. The second one is transnational spaces and networks of action. And the third one are the not so invited spaces for citizen participation. So the first one, right, Bomba planning, the intent with this paper was to explore grassroots recovery, the grassroots recovery movement in Puerto Rico. And when I talk about the grassroots movement, I'm talking about the activists, the community leaders, but also the communities that participate in the process, right? The communities that the activists serve. So that combination of actors is part of the grassroots movement. And this is not something that's fixed, right? It's fluid and it changes, and especially in post-disaster environments, considering time compression and how things move quickly and things adapt really quickly, and depending on how the needs evolve, the movements evolve as well. So my intent was to explore this movement in Puerto Rico, including the planning practices they mobilize, the meanings of those practices, and their spaces of action from an insurgent planning lens. And I'm obviously using insurgent planning literature, which highlights planning from a bottom-up planning as counter-hegemonic as transgressive, both in time and place, and as imaginative, right? Thinking about breaking with oppressive structures of power and rethinking alternative pathways towards more just and humane urbanism. So that's like in a gist, the whole idea behind insurgent planning. And then the method specifically for this paper, did a case study research method, and I investigated 3 key cases that, actually I investigated a lot more, but I compiled 3 as the main ones that amass a wide variety of stories from across Puerto Rico and allowed me to better illustrate how grassroots movements maneuvered and are still maneuvering through invited and invented spaces of action during disaster recovery. And some of the findings, right, in a gist, basically, but we can talk about this more in Q&A later. So bottom-up community recovery in Puerto Rico was mainly pursued by a dynamic interactive relationships within grassroots movements, particularly between the activists and organizers and the communities that they serve. So I developed the notion of Bomba planning, basically as an analytic device to understand community recovery from a decolonial standpoint. And then in terms of more specific description, Bomba planning involves a set of transformative practices and meanings mobilized through invited and invented spaces of action and based on a co-constitutive activist community engagement. So I want to talk a little bit more about Bomba before I continue to explain Bomba planning. And I don't know how familiar all of you are with Bomba, but I'll say some broad things about it. Basically, Bomba is a Puerto Rican music style and dance. And I know you'll be visiting Loíza in the summer, and Loíza has a strong Bomba culture. And it is perhaps one of the most important places for Bomba in Puerto Rico. Actually, there's a place near Rio Herrera, which is at the far east side of the municipality of Loíza, where it connects with Rio Grande, and right where the river meets the beach, right at that beach, at that point, there's a woman called Sheila Osorio, and she has a practice of Bomba there, and all weekends she plays Bomba there, and she teaches. There's classes. I think you pay like $20 and you get like an hour class for dancers, and then also if people want to learn how to do the drumming, they can also do that there. So if you have the chance, Loíza it's a very nice spot, and there's a restaurant close by so you can eat as well. So I don't work for them, but I'm just saying. So broadly speaking, right, Bomba, we have 3 main components. There's the percussion, the drumming, the dancing, and the singing. But perhaps maybe the most emblematic thing about Bomba is the creative, interactive relationship among those actors, right, which are the dancers, percussionists, or drummers, and the singers. For example, let's take the relationship between the dancer and the drummer. So rather than dancing to the rhythm played by the drummers, which is, how dances usually go, the dancer with his or her dance steps and dance moves creates their own rhythm, right? Basically, the dancer produces a series of gestures and steps, and they call this piquetes, to which the main drummer provides a synchronized beat, right? So the drummer follows the dancer rather than vice versa, which is the more common in folk dances. So the main drum's primary function is to replicate every single move of the dancer, and this is done almost instantaneously, right? As the dancer moves, the drummer plays. And if you haven't seen this, you can look it up in Google. There are a bunch of in YouTube. I mean, there are some videos there. You can write Bomba, Puerto Rican Bomba dance, and you'll see some of this. But also you'll be in Loíza in a week, so nothing better than live performance. Actually, this is right there where I'm talking about in Loíza. This is an event they do. I think the last Sunday of every month or something like that. But the whole idea is that the dancer and the drummer, the musician, together, right? They co-create a bomba performance, right? Without the dancer, the drummer won't be able to play. And they together, right, they co-create this bomba performance. So when thinking about bomba planning and drawing from how bomba has been developed in Puerto Rico, and I'm skipping a lot of important stuff about bomba, this historical background, right? It's mainly a practice developed by enslaved Africans in Puerto Rico during the Spanish colonial period, and they used it, you know, as a to plan rebellions in many cases, but also to as you know, time went by and they were able, and slavery was transitioned into something different, and they used bomba to celebrate, to communicate, to tell stories, right? So it's very context sensitive and it's historically constructed. And with this, I mean that the grassroots movements in bomba planning, right, mimicking what happens in bomba, they place historical memory and historical consciousness at the center of their practice, right? Colonialism, repeated disaster, but also resistance, right? And a pursuit of transformation and of something different. It's a resistance and a recovery movement, right? They resist oppressive and unjust structures. They resist displacement. They resist erasure, but they also seek to recover their spaces and their livelihoods. And they also advocate, right? Talking about the meanings they add to their practices. They advocate for a just recovery, for just transitions, but overall for self-determination. And they use autonomous organizing, mutual support, and other needs-driven iterative approaches that are counter-hegemonic, they're imaginative, and they move across invited and invented spaces of action. So this is a combination of things that are that make bomba planning a particular articulation of insurgent planning, right? Which is context sensitive. I think it's one of the things that's missing in insurgent planning literature is that how it moves across jurisdictions. So we've seen it in Africa, we've seen it in Brazil and Mexico. We've never seen it being documented in contexts like Puerto Rico. So I think the bomba planning notion provides a more tailored approach to understanding that you know, the differences between being counter-hegemonic against neoliberalism, being counter-hegemonic against colonial structures, or being counter-hegemonic against other systems or structures of oppressive practice. So that was paper one, and I know I took a lot of time there, but paper two focuses more on transnational spaces and networks of action. And my intent with this paper was to understand how Chicago's Puerto Rican diaspora developed a transnational recovery network to help people in Puerto Rico, right? They organized initiatives and campaigns from Chicago to help people in Puerto Rico, but also they designed and developed campaigns to help those Puerto Ricans that ended up being displaced and that migrated to Chicago. Right? So it's simultaneous practices on both sides. And I use a transnationalism from below framework, but this is part of a greater conversation in transnational literature. And I know there's different practices, and I'm still trying to make some final determinations about the framing of this paper, if it's just cross-border actions, if it's transnationalism from below. I think it's useful, but there are new developments like the concept of simultaneity. Right, so I'm still exploring this, but the whole idea is that looking from a bottom-up standpoint, understanding how these transnational dynamics were happening, how people in Puerto Rico were using whatever help was sent by diasporic communities, but also how the diaspora organized and affected policy in Chicago, in Humboldt Park region, to accommodate those climate refugees that were getting there from Puerto Rico, and accommodate them not just in terms of housing and essential services, but also in schools, getting them jobs, and just a lot of things, right? Very interesting stuff. And methods, also a case study research method that I center most of the study around a coalition. It's called the Puerto Rican Agenda of Chicago. EVIS has been part of that coalition for a long time. And they basically, right, it's a coalition of other organizations that do different types of work in Puerto Rico and that have different relationships to different communities in Puerto Rico. So it's a very diverse group. And also has a very like long history of connection with Puerto Rico and activism and advocacy and policy change, etc., community building. And some of the findings of this paper that the Puerto Rican Agenda work included rescue missions, emergency relief, reconstruction, right? This is their famous 3 Rs for Puerto Rico campaign. They were able to harness their social and political capital to advance recovery efforts, right? And in the paper, I go a little bit into detail exactly about how they harness their political capital by mobilizing their local politicians, local city officials as well. And they advanced a form of transnational solidarity planning that I think has been underdeveloped in planning theory, especially since it affects local policy to benefit refugees and creating bridges between municipalities in Puerto Rico that were otherwise less involved with each other. So that connection, I know Ivis knows a lot about this, but that connection between Loíza and Comerío back before Hurricane Maria to this date has evolved a lot. And one of the reasons why it has evolved a lot is thanks to the work of the Puerto Rican Agenda, but also other municipalities have also developed new networks here in Puerto Rico, thanks to the work of different organizations in the diaspora, including the Puerto Rican Agenda. And we can talk more about that in the Q&A section. But just to continue with paper 3, this is the not so invited spaces of participation. So my intent with this paper was to interrogate why invited spaces of participation in Puerto Rico have failed to secure meaningful and empowering engagement. There has been a lot of talk about how this planning processes developed at the state and municipal levels are required by the federal funds, including FEMA funds and HUD funds for community development, disaster recovery. And they are required to do citizen participation and citizen engagement. But then how has that translated into practice in Puerto Rico, and why has it failed to secure meaningful, empowering engagement? So that paper talks about that. And I mostly use literature on disaster recovery planning. And this was a qualitative research of participant observations, secondary sources, etc. Interacted a lot with people at Vivienda, working with CDBGDR funds, a lot with different planning professionals in municipalities across the island. Also, private planners that work as private consultants in private firms that have been hired as contractors to do work for municipalities that have low planning capacity, and low grant management capacity. And this is basically where I drew the map. Some of the findings of this paper is basically, that the invited spaces of citizen participation have been a show of tokenism, right? Of limited tokenism, if that's even a concept. So it's very restricted form of citizen participation. And I'm using the concept a little bit of Arnstein, the classic Arnstein ladder of citizen participation. She has 3 main rungs of citizen participation. The first 3 are degrees of no participation, and tokenism is within that first rung of the ladder. So it's very limited form, mostly focused on informing citizens, just letting them know what's going on. And communities and even municipalities, right? But not really involving them in the process. And there's also been minimal capacity building. Before the hurricane, there was like I mentioned earlier, a starvation of resources in Puerto Rico at all levels of government and community organizations. And one of the things that was discussed more after the hurricane was the necessity to build capacity, right? To build planning capacities, administrative capacities at different levels of government, so that funds will be used in more effective and socially just ways, and to create more opportunities for meaningful and empowering engagement. That hasn't been the case, and that hasn't happened in Puerto Rico. And also another thing that has been a great issue in this whole formal planning process in Puerto Rico is how they prioritize compliance over planning. right? There's more grant management, finance, administration, dealing with all the federal requirements and federal regulations, and even state regulations, which sometimes are even more even put more restrictions on things. They even restrict more than even the federal government. It's a little it's actually crazy how that has been the case. But the compliance then overshadows planning, right? And limits the capacity of planning when you have municipalities with a planning office. Those that do have a planning office have 3 or 4 planners that need to do 1,000 things at a time. And then you put this complex bureaucratic processes where you say you have all these funds available, but it's all about compliance, right? So these planners don't really have the capacity and the time, the to dedicate enough to citizen participation, to citizen involvement, to capacity building. They're really paying attention to all this, and most of them have just decided to let the private firms do the work, right? Let them do the plans, let them deal with all the compliance issues, and we'll just get the final product. But as we all know from planning in general, right? If you're not involved in the planning process, especially at local level, and you don't feel like that's your plan, you don't feel like that's really your vision, your mission, the things you want to accomplish. And without that community engagement, this has been documented in literature, in many different ways. But without community engagement in the process, there's the opportunities for that plan or that process to be effective, to lead to something in the implementation phases that the community actually can get behind, it's limited, right? So that's also one of the main issues that I found here in Puerto Rico, especially in those recovery planning programs. So to kind of like final thoughts, discussion and conclusion, I think it's important, right, to look at disaster recovery. If we want to really understand community recovery, engaging with the process from a bottom-up standpoint involves looking at different grassroots planning practices and spaces of action and figuring out the relationships between them. And it also may require constructing the whole from the sum of the parts. And I think this is perhaps one of the most fun parts of my work, and the thing that I enjoyed the most in my dissertation is having 3 papers that tell 3 different stories, but they're all talking about the same phenomenon, about the same issue, but from different standpoints, right? And how and centering community recovery and community empowering and capacity building, and then seeing how this is actually happening on the ground. I think that's very interesting. I think looking at that will help other post-disaster jurisdictions, not just in the US, right? Because this has happened before in after Hurricane Katrina, after Harvey, after Irma, even in Florida, after Hurricane Sandy in New York. This has happened before in the US, but it has also happened globally in other contexts. And so my goal was to present a 3-dimensional view of the spaces of action communities use, either they're the grassroots in Puerto Rico and then how they differ from each other, or are they transnational, right? Originating from Chicago, but connecting here to Puerto Rico and perhaps to other communities in the diaspora as well. And I think this approach also has helped me better contextualize and examine the different forms of planning mobilized for post-disaster recovery, which I think planning is still an emerging field in disaster recovery in general. And we need to think more about how to take advantage of the strengths in post-disaster environments, and looking at community recovery and looking at grassroots movements, I think provides an opportunity to more creatively and more imaginatively think about how can we do better moving forward, especially as climate change promises to exacerbate disaster events and disaster processes, but also the increasing social and economic inequality, right? And obviously, looking at this 3-dimensional view, has the opportunity to provide a more holistic characterization and representation of stories and events that I think sometimes is actually often missing from a lot of the work that's been published on disaster recovery. It's usually from one standpoint and one version of stories and events, right? So this 3-dimensional approach tells a more holistic story.